The Palais de France is one of the grandest palaces of Istanbul. It was the first French embassy ever. Its gardens and grounds still look onto European soil, with a French school to one side, the Italian consulate on the other, and the Church of Saint Louis of the French. The Consulate General of France and Professor Paolo Girardelli tell us of its past.
We are now in the Palais de France, the French palace used as embassy until the end of the Ottoman Empire, when Istanbul was the capital of the Ottoman Empire. And after the capital was transferred to Ankara, of course, it could no longer be an embassy. It was used for different purposes. Today, it is still an official building where, with some parts reserved for the ambassador, for the French ambassador when he comes to Istanbul, and also where the French consul actually lives. Of course, this is not the original French embassy that was built approximately on the same site in the late 16th century. There is nothing left of that building. This building was destroyed by fire and rebuilt at least 3 times. So what we see today is mainly the reconstruction that happened after the fire of 1831. An architect called Laurecisque came from Paris to design the new French palace. Before the 1767 fire, the French embassy in this site looked very much like an Ottoman building, like a Turkish Ottoman konak, so it was a wooden building. Later, the ambassador Saint-Priest, the Comte de Saint-Priest, after this 1767 fire, decided to reconstruct the building in a more European neoclassical style. And this building was went through a complex history because, as you know, during the French Revolution, French-Ottoman relations were at some point very tense, and the French ambassador was arrested even. And this palace was given to the British. So for a few years, the old palace before this one was used by Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to Constantinople in around 800. Before the 1767 fire, we had some drawings made around 1720 by a French architect who was actually also sent to Istanbul to design a new palace. But he designed it, but it was never built. But before designing the new palace, he also did a very accurate survey of the old palace wooden building in a Turkish Ottoman style. So today we know exactly how it looked. So there are several tapestries. Some of them are much older than this building, actually. They are made in Gobelin, so it's the most prestigious French manufactory for tapestries. Some of the drawings for these tapestries were made by a major French artist of the 17th century, Lebrun. Here you see an interesting combination: the Bourbon coat of arms with lilies and the Cross of Malta. Now, Malta is the Cross of Malta is on all of these tapestries, and it's very important because the role of the French ambassadors here in Istanbul and in the Mediterranean was also connected with ransoming slaves. And as you know, Malta was the real center of the Mediterranean. It was the only Christian island that far southeast in the Mediterranean. And all transactions regarding slaves were handled with the mediation of Malta. Many ambassadors and many members of the Corps Diplomatique were also Knights of Malta. So and there is one interesting story about one prominent French ambassador called Vergin. He had a very difficult, he went really in great trouble with the Sultan Mustafa III around 1760 because an Ottoman ship, actually the admiral ship of the Sultan Mustafa III, whose rowers were all Christian, they were Catholic slaves, they mutinied and they escaped to Malta. So the Sultan was left without his most important ship, and this created a crisis between France and the Ottoman. The French ambassador was held responsible. He was in a way protecting all the Christians, so he was held responsible for this flee of the ship to Malta. He tried to say, well, I'm not Maltese, but the Sultan and the Ottoman authority held him responsible. So in the end, he had to persuade the French king, Louis XV, to buy back from the Knights of Malta this ship and give it back to the Sultan. And in this way, his prestige, of course, raised. He could able to solve a major diplomatic crisis in which, as I said, Malta was directly involved. Pera is a rather late urban development. The oldest part of this section of Istanbul was Galata, and Galata was built inside an enclosure of walls. Pera is the suburban development of Galata outside the walls. It was densely inhabited only near the Bosphorus shore, so what today is Tophane, and up to Beşiktaş, I would say, was full with wooden houses of the Turkish Ottoman type. But then in the 18th century we have this phenomenon. Pera is beginning to grow upwards towards the height of what today is Istiklal. And many new Catholic churches are built there near Istiklal, because that began to be the most important artery, the most important street. And the lower parts of Pera were becoming more Turkish, more Islamic. So the ambassadors and all the Catholic and European inhabitants start moving upwards. But when these, also after the 1831 fire, all the area was still very much a Turkish settlement of wooden houses. That's why it burned so violently. And when these palaces were built, they made a sharp contrast. They were surrounded by wooden houses, very modest, and so they stood out a lot more than they do today. In the everyday life of Pera, of course, Pera was a district whose entire life largely revolved around diplomacy. It was the district of diplomacy where some major decisions regarding European policy in the Ottoman Empire were taken, but also everyday life was affected, and rituals, behavior. Everyone had to dress or behave according to his or her rank. The interpreters were very important, the so-called dragomans. All the members of every embassy had some up to 100 people living around and gravitating. Now, an interesting story concerning this obsession with protocol, with rank and precedence. Of course, not all the ambassadors had the same importance, the same relevance, and they were also accepted by the Ottoman government in a certain order. But among them, the French ambassador usually ranked first. But of course, there was a strong opposition by other from other European powers, especially in the 18th century, when British ascendancy began, and Russian ascendancy also began to grow. And regarding this question of protocol and press, there is an interesting episode, a very funny story. In the streets of Pera, which many of these streets were very narrow, when two ambassadors had to pass from the same narrow alley, of course, one of them had to, the ambassadors always moved around with a retinue, with a cortege of at least 20 or 30 people. So the less important ambassador should wait and let the other one pass. Now, a funny incident occurred when I think the French and the British ambassador were entering the same alley, and none of them wanted to give way to the other, because they both thought that they were more important. So they stood for hours, and the street was blocked, and people started to complain. And in the end, they had to demolish the janissaries and the municipality. They had to demolish a wall, so to enlarge the street and make these two corteges pass at the same time. So this is how these questions of protocol affected the whole life of the district. This garden is developed on four terraces, 4 levels, and it was, even when, as I said, the palace was in an Ottoman Turkish style, the garden could be really designed and arranged in a European, usually in an Italian style. So it created an image, a peculiar image, very different from the Ottoman Turkish gardens. It was more geometrical, more designed, and it also, of course, served for social purposes. Several receptions were held here, and sometimes also Ottoman members of the Divan would be invited to the gardens. We see some details from that period, and especially this monogram LP that you see inside the triangular pediment on this wing of the building facing the garden. Those are, of course, the initials of Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe of the Orléans house was the king of France between 1830 and 1848, when this embassy was rebuilt. And the building looks really like a French building from that period. It doesn't look very much like what you see today in Paris, because Paris today was the result of a reconstruction after 1850s, 1860s. But this is rather older. I mean, this shows you how an official French building from the 1830s or 40s would look like.
So it's mainly a place where we greet our friends. In fact, it was at the beginning, as you know, the first French embassy in the world, until the displacement of the capital to Ankara in 1923. It was the embassy. I think there is two things in this palace. There is yes, the rooms that you have seen, and the ballroom is a very nice one. I think it's really the example of what was the French architecture in the early 19th century, because the palace was built between 1839 and 1847. And it has its own life, and it's a beautiful one. But for me, the second thing is that the gardens are giving a little bit of the spirit of the palace. So you have the palace in itself, and the brightness of gold and of all those old tapestries. But when you go outside, you have the gardens, which are very quiet in the middle of a very noisy environment. And for a lot of people, coming here is first, yes, getting to the history of the palace, at the same time coming to an area which is very quiet in the middle of you know, Istiklal Caddesi is very close. You can imagine there is a lot of noise, a lot of music, and it does something to people to come here and then to be in a quiet environment. So I think it's very nice. And as I said, the last thing is that it's really our history, and you have here an example of what were the capitulations. Francois I and Soliman signed the first capitulations. It was in 1536, and here all around you find all the elements of this agreement, because you have the Palace of Justice. I don't know if you have gone there, but it's very interesting, and you have even a jail here, that because the organization of the empire was such that the French ambassador, as the communities, had the responsibility of his own people. And so he was able to judge some of the people and even to put them in jail if it was necessary. So it's a kind of very interesting testimony of what was the empire and what were our relations with Turkey at that time. You can expect for, you know, so many centuries, the relations were at some time very, very good. At some time, you know, when Bonaparte invaded Egypt, for example, the relations were not very good, as you can imagine. So you have a lot of stories about the palace, about the people that were in the palace. At one point we were in the Venetian palace, which is on the other side of the road, and the British ambassador was in our palace. So, you know, you have a lot of stories because it is history. And it gives me, when I talk to our Turkish friends, I'm telling them, look, those relations were so old. Yes, we will have, you know, maybe sometimes difficulties, but we will have very good moments. And on the long run, it's a relationship that is going very deep into the two people. So that's on what we have to work.
This is the most panoramic spot of the garden of the French palace, and from here we understand how important was the architecture of the embassies in the development of Pera, of this district. Just behind me you see the Venetian palace, which is also in that site since the 16th century, so from a period as old as that of the French palace. And Venice, like France, had a very important relationship with the Ottomans. Their two embassies were close to each other. They were developed, I would say, in close connection with each other. When the French palace was burned in 1767, also the Venetian palace was damaged, and the Venetian ambassador decided to reconstruct, also following a more Western European style instead of the former Ottoman type of building. The Venetian palace was also a wooden building of the Ottoman type until the late 18th century. The story is also very complex because, yeah, it was Venetian when Venice was a republic, an independent republic, but of course Venice finished to exist as a republic in the Napoleonic period, and then the Venetian palace, after being used for a few years by the French, was given to the Austrians, to the Habsburg, and it became the Austrian embassy to the Ottoman capital, to Istanbul, for roughly 100 years. What we see today, this imposing facade behind me, is actually what the Austrians reconstructed around 1914, 1915. So it's a rather new building, but the interior layout is very much based on the old Venetian palace that was built here at the end of the 18th century. Now all these buildings, especially the French and the Venetian, which were the older ones, were not simply embassies but palaces, also in a political sense. They are always called palaces: Palais de France, Palais de Venise, Palais de Russie, the Russian palace. Why? Because especially in Istanbul, an embassy is not simply a representative institution. An embassy is a kind of a small royal palace. Embassy buildings were called, they are still called palaces because they really were centers of power. Each embassy had the responsibility and the jurisdiction over thousands of foreign inhabitants. It was not like a simple embassy in a European country. The ambassador was also the political head of a large community, not only French or Venetians, but also the Ottomans who gained protection from these powers were gravitating around these sort of courts.
For me, it's very important to live in the middle of our history. That's I think the most important thing. Yes, it is a big building, so it's not always very easy to live in it and to give our own soul in the building. But the building has its own soul coming from the past. As I told you, we are here since the Ottoman Empire. In fact, since late 15th, so the late 16th century, 1590 or something like this. So you see there is a lot of history here, and it's showing the depth of the French-Turkish relationship, because it's almost 5 centuries. So you can imagine what there is on this land, because we are on this land for that time.